the development of life forms, the most important phenomenon that happens is the ability for continuity to accrue. Without the ability for a continuity to accrue, to add together, there would be no possibility for differentiation. Life seems to have solved this particular problem initially with the way in which cells are able to perform their life function. On the DNA level, the ability for two strands of bases to come together in an opposite direction zippering is one of the most remarkable aspects of the ability of continuity accruing and leading towards further differentiation. The double helix has two strands which go in opposite directions so that they can be said to be in complementarity. Now, the DNA strands curl somewhere around 300,000 times in a normal given strand of DNA. The replication of a cell requires that that DNA strand undo itself and replicate itself within about 20 minutes, so that every cell in your body does and undoes itself at the rate of about 750 breaks or links per second, so that nature has no time to think about it. This split-second timing, this almost nanosecond pace which biological life must reach, is also the pace of intelligence. And so an education like this needs to uplift out of the normal pace of events to a higher speed, which requires effort. It requires not only attention, but it requires that you prepare yourself to receive what the attention is going to register, so that the continuity accruing has to do with two fundamental processes, also that form of complementation. One of them is creativity, the other is receptivity. Creativity is not simply some kind of freelance reaching out to something new. This would be a pedestrian way of understanding creativity. There's always a shaping gestalt. There's always a form quality, a forming quality to creativity. And that forming quality of creativity must in every instance pair itself with an unformed receptivity, so that the form works with the space of receptivity all the time. They form a pair. Just as in the DNA double strands, there are always pairs of bases that work together. Adenine and thymine work together. Guanine and cytosine work together. They form pairs. So the pairedness and the ability to pair pairs so that you have a square or a quaternity has something to do with this continuity of accruing and allowing then for a build-up of differential creativity and at the same time a mounting receptivity. This is extremely important in education. as the speaker in this particular chair, using a kind of a Krishnamurti technique, the speaker uses the voice creatively, and you must use your ear receptively. And they must link together. They form a pair. And without either of us intending or manipulating or planning, the continuity of this paired attention will by itself, because it's a life principle, accrue both the creativity into form and larger forms, more diverse forms, and the receptivity into vaster space, deeper receptivity. So that there is a double penetrating quality. Now, in ancient times, that double penetrating quality of the attention to form and the non-attention to non-form, understand that the non-attention to non-form is also conscientious, just as the attention to form is conscientious. And to do both processes paired together at the same time is the very essence of what we would call real. Before anything exists, this reality obtains. The ancient model for this, the ancient example for this, was the nighttime sky. That the stars were able to be seen always in the context of a deep, open darkness of space surrounding them, so that stars and space together were the fabric of heaven. That the stars made constellations, formed into patterns that were seen after long generations, millennia of concentration. The Chinese and the ancient Iranians shared the ability to appreciate that the attentiveness to constellated forms of stars had a reciprocal attentiveness, or we should say a non-attentiveness, to the space. That both processes occurred at the same time. So that in the 3rd millennia BC, there came several figures who were seminal in human history on this planet. One of them, the first of them, was in China, and his name was Fu Xi. And Fu Xi always was presented as the dragon becoming man, or the man who still had his dragon roots, so that it would be a torso of a man with a large serpent's tail. The rest of the body would be like a serpent's tail, a dragon's tail. In Chinese tradition, he lived about 2900 BC in our dating, our calendar. The second figure in Iran was Zarathustra. Zarathustra actually will be able to be dated about 2200 BC. In the West, Zarathustra is called Zoroaster, which means stargazer. Someone who is able to look at the stars and see them for what they are, and to understand both their what they are and what they are not equally well, understanding stars and space equally well, which gave to the ancient Iranian temperament a quality of the ability to understand, to appreciate that formlessness was a part of the real and always was a complement to form. So that the Iranian temperament exhibits its precision in mystical gestalts. One finds no Aristotle in Iran, but one finds a Hafiz. One finds a Rumi. One finds a Jami. Now the Greek mind, brain, was extremely different from the Irani mind, brain, the ancient Avestic, even before Farsi. Zarathustra wrote in Avestic. But the ancient Irani mind was very close to the ancient Chinese mind. So that the Chinese sense of Tao is very easy for the Irani mind to appreciate, very difficult for the Greek mind to appreciate. And the Greek mind was the fastest, most supple, most mobile, most fluid of all the Western minds. And lower down on the rung of mobility, of fluidity, was the Latin language-based mind. And the Latin language brain cannot comprehend the Chinese language brain, nor the Irani language brain. And most of the institutional glue that is passed down to us to our own day is based on the Latin language brain. Now, this is a deeper problem than left brain, right brain. While left brain, right brain is certainly a structural reality, the world in which we live is conditioned by the institutional glues of the language-formed brain. We will get to that in about 3 months. Our education will eventually find its way into that area, that region, that venue of subject matter, and we will call that ritual. But for now, we must lay a substrate. We cannot understand anything further about life and ourselves with any kind of clarity until we immerse ourselves into nature. The only traction that we have in existence is with nature. And as we will appreciate again and again, deeper and deeper over the next few weeks, nature does not exist. Nature occurs before existence happens. And in a very deep way, nature can be appreciated, but not specified. And the appreciation of nature is in this mysterious energy wave, which has a continuity and has the ability to accrue, the ability to remember what had gone before and to develop new differential forms of things unknown. So that in order to give us an initial focus, I composed a meditation a number of years ago, and the meditation reads like this. It's page 5 of our educational pamphlet. No future exists without real education. Future, as an existential possibility, relies on an extended past enduring through a present order. Without an extended past, without a present order, no future exists. Even an idea like the future connotes experience and understanding woven into a transmissible continuity, which most certainly is the reality of education. Tradition, on the tribal ritual level, tradition does this education for man. On a tribal family level, tradition does this. It's the accrued continuity that both repeats and forms the present order and allows for a future to occur. Even on a national level, tradition is the way education generally works, even today. Most curricula, more or less, reflect traditional values pumped into production teaching. Schools traditionally are vehicles for social continuity of its traditional values. And put in these words, a certain tautological short circuit becomes apparent at last. Tradition develops itself. Traditional values are self-interest, justified by characteristic techniques of weaving the extended past into some present order so that a continued future will obtain. In this ecology of social cycle and educational ceremony, the primary function served is continuity of interpretation. This continuity on a natural level is tradition. It's the mythology, or rather the very context of the mythology by which the meaning of all is generated. But beyond this is another scale, another level. Beyond tradition, in its mythic reinforcement, is the conscious level of personality with its own historic reinforcement. The tradition of the new, the forms of things unknown, require freedom. And this freedom does not occur in the integration cycle of nature. It occurs in a complementary cycle of differential consciousness. And one of the largest of all gestalts to appreciate the very fabric of this education is the complementary weaving of two strands. One, an integration strand, which always pairs itself quite precisely with a differential strand that moves in the opposite direction. And instead of saying opposite direction, it's better to use the term complementarity. The two directions are complements. They not only meet each other at some initial point, but they continue to meet each other at every point. Every locus, every focus has the integration and differentiation paired together in this complementation. If we were blessed with the ability to be attentive enough like Zarathustra or like Fuxi, we would always be aware of the background and the context at the same time as being cognitive of the form. This education seeks to sensitize us to this ancient technique. This is the very foundation of wisdom, this ancient technique of complementation. Instruction would be paying attention to the form of things known. Education is quite different, a larger context, as well as the forms of things known, the context which generates the non-forms of things unknown. Now, the Chinese, better than any other population on the planet, found a way to express in a rather permanent and, I would say, enduring way, for we can use it still today, some 5,000 years later. The Chinese put the complementation of the two directions that at the same time could be seen as the structure of DNA, put them into a form known as the hexagram. And the hexagram sequence became the matrix of change, which characterized was a language to not only describe nature, but a language to present nature. Now, this is a rather packed statement, so let me unfold it. Let me open it for just a minute. We will see that in nature, the ability to image things is characteristic of our neuronal, our nervous system. The ability for an image to occur, an audio image, a visual image, olfactory image, most primal of all, the sense of touch, the touch image. One can go a long ways in logic by learning that logical certainty is based on the sense of touch and not on visuals. One of the flaws of Greek-based logic was that it was sight-based rather than India logic, which was always feeling-based. There are many areas that we could explore, but we don't have time for that. What we're doing now is to try to focus for ourselves on a movement of comprehension that is the very backbone, the very substrate of the way in which education occurs, and that this is an education occurring in this ecology because this is the way in which what is real happens. The most ancient image of Fu Shi has him intertwined with another figure, which is his wife, his sister, his consort, his complement. Her name is Nu Kwa. Nu Kwa. They each hold an instrument, a tool. Fu Shi holds in one hand a carpenter's square, which is an L shape that has a bar across the angle so that when you're constructing, you can square off post and beam, but you can also have a 45-degree angle, which you can draw at any time. This carpenter's square is the symbol for form, for the creative ability to make form. And that creative ability to make form has a paired nature in and of itself. The pair that works together in creativity is that one can repeat and that one can innovate at the same time. You can repeat the exact angle, the squaring, the 45 degrees, but you can apply it in new ways so that the accrued continuity has in itself not only the repetition again and again of the same, but the slight alteration of the repetition to produce something new. This is the very form in which life energy seems to prefer. Existence happens in this way. It loves to repeat again and again with slight modifications all the time. And from time to time, the proportion of the exact repetition vis-a-vis the novel application of it, that proportion, that ratio, that form of differential relatedness hits upon a note which is sustainable. It's like energy in its movement, in its sinuosity, in its sine wave motion. Energy has preferential intensities at which it registers like the ringing of a bell. At certain energy on the electromagnetic spectrum, at a certain energy, so many angstroms of energy will produce red light. If there's a slight difference, you can produce an orange light. A slighter difference, you can produce yellow, You could produce a green light, eventually blue, eventually run off into the ultraviolet. All of these are modulations of the same energy frequency, the electromagnetic frequency. But that electromagnetic frequency could not work without a complementary energy frequency. And that complementary energy frequency is magnetoelectric energy. And its frequency is about 10 billion times the intensity of the electromagnetic spectrum. They always work together. The one unseen because it is too energetic to register at all with any of the existential things like eyes, ears, taste, touch, nevertheless is there all the time. For the Chinese, 5,000 years ago, this double complementarity, this zippered pairedness, which must have the ability to join together and to come apart, to be undone and to be done. And to do this rapidly, so that in 20 minutes a cell with 300,000 twists to every DNA strand can simply undo itself and replicate itself again. So that nature has this incredible acrobatic fluidity which characterizes its reality. Our attempts to freeze dry the static image of something are staggered into imbecility by the rapidity and the rate at which this happens. And so our ability to image the existential exactness becomes staggered by the acrobatic fluidity of the real. And so the Chinese, 5,000 years ago, hit upon a binary way of expressing this pairedness, that always the form and the formlessness would be linked together, and that when one would have to keep conscious of the fact that when you are talking about the form, one is also including implicitly the formless. And because this was so difficult to talk about in a formed way, the formless quality became primordial. And the formless quality was designated Tao. And so one always spoke then about Tao, but when one was speaking about Tao, when one was using language about Tao, whenever you say Tao, Tao is there before there's a voice, before there's an ear. And so implicit in Tao is Te. Te is the thusness, the oomph, the actuality of things. Te guarantees existence. And as Te guarantees existence, it's like the stars that appear. The sky space, which is blue during the day, because only one star shines, our star, named Sol. But as Sol goes down, as our sun goes down through the horizon, more stars come into play. In just this way, Te comes out of Tao. It is always there, but manifestation occurs in a kind of a rhythm that the more a glaring singularity subsides and allows for multiplicity to come out, the more the multiplicity shows a miraculous universe. In a very parallel way, the ego, the ordinary self, the identifying quality of our personality, is like the sun. It maintains itself and creates a sense of personal sky, which is just simply blue. Beautiful at times, stormy at other times, but it's always daytime. It is only when the ego submerges itself that the actuality of other stars, of other persons, begins to shine. And one has to learn that the submerging of the ego does not kill it, does not diminish it, but rather gives us this perspective of having a nighttime, of seeing others as real, seeing by their light. Now, this quality of being able to have a complementation in one's consciousness, in one's life, while cited about 5,000 years ago, first by the Chinese, and maintained all the way up into the present day, in the wilderness West, the United States of about 200 years ago, there were qualities of human beings that were very similar to those of ancient Iranian or ancient Chinese times. One of the figures in this ancient quality was Thoreau, Henry David Thoreau. And we pair Thoreau with the I Ching to begin our education. Let's take a look at an entry in one of Thoreau's journals. He was just about 20 years old. Let's listen to his language and try to note in his language some of what I've been talking about today. Let's use this selection of a few paragraphs from Thoreau's journal very early on. This is volume 1 of the journal. 3 other volumes have been published so far, and there are 20 volumes of journals. So this is very early on in his journals. June 20th, 1840. So that this is the evening of midsummer in 1840 in the primordiality of the United States, quite different from the United States of today. Here's how Thoreau wrote, and let's use this passage as a summary of what I've been talking about so far today. He writes in his notebook, in his journal, "The faint bugle notes which I hear in the west seem to flash on the horizon like heat lightning. Cows low in the street, more friendly than ever, and the note of the whippoorwill borne over the fields is the voice with which the woods and moonlight woo me. I shall not soon forget the sounds which lulled me when falling asleep on the banks of the Merrimack River. Far into the night, I hear some tyro beating a drum incessantly with a view to some country muster, and am thrilled by an infinite sweetness, as of a music which the breeze drew from the sinews of war. I think of the line, when the drum beat at dead of night. How I wish it would wake the whole world to march to its melody. But still it drums on alone in the silence and the dark. Cease not, thou drummer of the night. Thou too shalt have thy reward. The stars and the firmament hear thee, and their aisles shall echo thy beat till its call is answered, and the forces are mustered. The universe is attentive as a little child to thy sound, and trembles as if each stroke bounded against an elastic vibrating firmament. I shall be contented if the night never ended, for in the darkness heroism will not be deferred, and I see fields where no hero has couched his lance." And so you see a little bit of American Tao at a time when the United States was as incredibly pristine as 5th millennium BC China. It's the time not only of Thoreau, it's the time of the young Melville, the young Whitman, the full-grown Emerson. It's a time when there was a consciousness of form and an attentiveness to non-form in equanimity and paired together. One of the warning notes that came in this milieu came about 10 years later, and it appears for the first time in Moby Dick by Melville. And Melville's Moby Dick, which is one of our year-long readings. Remember, we always have pairs of texts, and we're using the Odyssey and Moby Dick as year-long pairs of texts, just as we're using the Portable Thoreau and the I Ching as initial pairs of text for the first month. The first month, the first year. So that we will change 12 times the pairs of texts before we change the pair of year-long reading texts. A complementation that moves in opposite directions. The Odyssey is a feminine journey of receptivity. Odysseus must learn deeper and deeper the receptivity of life. For without deepening his receptivity, he will never make it home. Because what he is returning to is not simply to Ithaca, not to his kingdom, but he must return to Penelope, his wife. He must return in such a way that she will accept him. And the Odyssey is all about the conditions of formlessness which are essential to Penelope for her to accept her complement back. If Odysseus is not able to be receptive enough, she will not accept him. He will have no homecoming. Moby Dick, on the other hand, is the masculine journey, the journey of creativity, the journey where one must learn to penetrate farther and farther into the realms of form, ever finer, ever more, instead of ever more delicate, ever more energetically. And somehow, in this balance, in Moby Dick, like in the passage read from Thoreau's journals, there comes a fateful locus, a focus of occurrence, an event horizon, as we would say in high-energy physics. There comes an event horizon, a moment of truth. And in this moment of truth, one realizes that to go further in either way, further in receptivity or further in creative penetration, there must be an equilibrium. For the syncopation of these energies must be always paired. And one cannot be more attentive without a further penetration, and one cannot penetrate further without a further receptivity. They're always paired. And to move to different levels, one must always take the step with a moment of equanimity. Higher orders of life require an equanimous threshold. One has to be able to occur on that equanimity, or you cannot rise to the next level. You cannot go to a higher order without being able to give oneself and to creatively be there at the very same time on these energy thresholds. It's just as in the electromagnetic spectrum, where at certain energy quantas, there registers the exactness of something like red light or something like green light. And in this exactness, in this continuity of energy, there appear areas where no energy registers whatsoever. So that energy occurs in a discontinuous continuity. It's not a continuity where every chink is filled, but it's a continuity where there are spaces where nothing registers whatsoever, where formlessness occurs. And so one speaks then of energy not just in terms of frequency, but the energy in its frequency also can be characterized as occurring in quanta. And this particular quanta will be exact for this particular occurrence, this particular thing. And the discontinuity of energy is extremely important, because only in the discontinuity will energy jump to a higher level, so that the whole structure of the atom is such that electrons will only occur at certain energy frequencies. They used to be called shells, because the mystical Judaism of the medieval period was the closest that anybody came in terms of seeing how energy shells can scintillate and move and jump. And so these energy shells, the orbits of electrons, or the orbits of planets around stars, or the orbits of stars within globular clusters of stars. And as we could see, the entire universe is based on resonances of exactness. Here is the way in which Melville characterizes in Moby Dick the precariousness of that equilibrium. For if you get lost at that particular moment, you will get lost in disappearance. And that is to be lost indeed. And so the ego always shies from those thresholds. This is the section on the masthead, where Melville writes about going up to the top of the masthead and looking out at the very pinnacle of the whaling ship. Very often do the captains of these ships take absent-minded philosophers to task, upbraiding them with not feeling sufficient interest in the voyage, half hinting that they are so hopelessly lost to all honorable ambition as that in their secret souls they would rather not see whales than otherwise. But all in vain. Those young Platonists have a notion that their vision is imperfect. They are short-sighted. What use then to strain the visual nerve? They have left their opera glasses at home. Why, thou monkey, said a harpooner to one of these lads, we've been cruising now hard upon 3 years, and thou hast not raised a whale yet. Whales are scarce as hen's teeth whenever thou art up here. Perhaps they were, or perhaps there might have been shoals of them in the far horizon, but lulled into such an opium-like listlessness of vacant, unconscious reverie is this absent-minded youth, by blending cadence of waves with thoughts, and thought at last he loses his identity, takes the mystic ocean at his feet for the visible image of that deep blue bottomless soul, pervading mankind and nature, and every strange, half-seen, gliding, beautiful thing that eludes him, every dimly discovered uprising fin of some undiscernible form seems to him the embodiment of those elusive thoughts that only people the soul by continually flitting through it. In this enchanted mood, thy spirit ebbs away to whence it came, becomes diffused through time and space, like Cranmer's sprinkled pantheistic ashes, forming at last a part of every shore the round globe over. There is no life in thee now except that rocking life imparted by the gently rolling ship, by her borrowed from the sea, by the sea from the inscrutable tides of God. But while this sleep, this dream is on ye, Move your foot or hand an inch, slip your hold at all, and your identity comes back in horror. Over Descartian vortices you hover, and perhaps at midday, in the fairest weather, with one half-throttled shriek, you drop through the transparent air into the summer sea, no more to rise forever. Heed it well, ye pantheists. Let's take a break. This is the ancient way of symbolizing what this education does. It was in ancient times presented as an infinity sign, like this, and it was always in its verticality, this quality of 8. Now, it's very difficult initially to appreciate why 8 is such a sacred number, or why numbers should be sacred at all. One can ask it in a very simple way. Why in this universe are certain numbers sacred? Because it is only at cardinal numerical focuses that existence forms stably enough to stay. Come again. The first time that existence is stable enough to stay is at 1. Even the word atonement is at one-ment. Unity. It doesn't mean unity within something else. Unity is all, allness. Allness. This is what the Chinese meant by Te. There is Tao, and when Tao moves, that is Te. When reality moves, that's existence. So it's not as if existence moves within the real. It's not as if Te occurs within Tao. That's a total misunderstanding. Why is it a total misunderstanding? Because it introduces fractionization where it does not occur. There are many relationalities where fractions are quite existential and quite real and very useful, but on this fundamental level, they do not occur at all. Wholeness comes out of mystery without leaving anything left over. There's no mystery left tucked away in some corner of esotericness. Existence has all the oomph that there is, which is why it is fertile, which is why existence is at the same time real. The ancient Chinese way of explaining or expressing or using the expression as an explanation of this is that somehow we must appreciate that the alternation of Tao and Te, the alternation of unity and mystery, produces in its sine wave a kind of a movement of energy. And that this movement always has the peaks and the valleys, just like a sine wave. Later on, many thousands of years later, 2,600 years after Fuxi, lived a Chinese thinker named Su Yan, and he's the one who designated the peaks as yang and the valleys as yin, and fathered a school of Chinese thought called the Yin-Yang School. But to try to understand the I Ching in terms of yin-yang initially is grave error. I know all the books have it. It's grave error. The most fundamental critique that could be applied is it's not realistic. The best way to understand the I Ching, and why are we trying to understand the I Ching? We're trying to understand the I Ching because it characterizes nature in such a way that we can be truthful in the way in which we talk about nature and think about nature, and we can use that truthfulness, that appropriateness, as a substrate, as a base upon which to build our education. It's just the way in which the hexagrams of the I Ching always build up from the base. They build up. So at the very first line, whatever it occurs, a moving line, an unbroken line, which is at a very fast rate so that it remains unbroken, or an unbroken line that is somewhat at a slower rate so that it tends to be broken very easily, an unbroken line that's very deep and so it stays unbroken. So that one can have, at the very beginning of a hexagram, 4 different conditions. One can have a very deep, penetrating, unbroken line, and one can have a very light, unbroken line. And to say that this line is yang because it's unbroken is to misconceive somewhat, to misunderstand. So that one has the capacity to appreciate the way in which the ancient Chinese built up the hexagrams has nothing to do with yin and yang, has everything to do with the secret exchange of equanimity. And one must appreciate the secret exchange of equanimity, not in terms of an idea, which is already symbolic and already very much too powerful for the tender beginnings of things. We're at the tender beginnings of an education, where we have to take our time to be open enough so that we are not catastrophically destroyed later on by the very weight of our own energy. There's a branch of modern mathematics known as catastrophe theory. In Jung's psychology, he borrowed an ancient pre-Socratic Greek term, enantiodromia, which he said characterizes events. That if you push a certain polarity to its ultimate, it will turn into its opposite. It's a universal law. Why? Because opposites at extremes exchange. They not only exchange at the exact middles, where it's very gentle, and the exchange is like a dance. One could choreograph the exchange at equanimity. But at the polar extremes, the exchange is catastrophic. You have no choice. There is no grace. There's no elegance whatsoever. It happens. At the beginning, it happens without you knowing about it, and at the end, it happens with you having nothing to say about it, and very often filled with regrets. Now, all of this becomes very germane because time, space, occurs in quanta, always occurs in form. Not only does energy occur in quanta, but time-space occurs in quanta. Time has forms, and when a time form is over, that time form is catastrophically finished. It doesn't work anymore ever at all again. And when some new time form is beginning, just at the beginning of it, there's only mystery, there's only reality. And one has to deal with this in a practical way. Otherwise, there's no traction. There's no comprehension. Now, you can see how quickly our language and our concerns become immediate and very vast. We're not ready for that yet. towards the end of this year, we can talk this way. And towards the end of next year, we can talk this way with great deal of certainty. Towards the end of next year, we can bring out for ourselves something like this National Geographic illustration of the universe, a map of the universe, where in 7 steps one can see the placement of the quanta of proportions of our reality. Down at the bottom here is our planets circling our sun. And you can look at this illustration later on in detail. But the planets circling our sun make a star system. And this star system is a part of a family of stars. There are about 50 stars that make a family around Sirius, Procyon, Wolf 359, a whole bunch of other little stars exist together as a family. It takes about 20 light years to go into our star family. But that star family exists within a much larger cluster. And from the level at which that larger cluster gains definition, becomes the existential pattern, the object which it is, a star cluster, one is already so far out that there is no possibility of discerning planets, much less our size, much less the size of anything less than us. And that's only about midway in the proportion and scale of the physical universe that is existence. And behind that and underneath that, the inscrutable tides of God, as Melville says. This education seeks to sensitize us all the time to all of it. And so from time to time, there may be a language referent that doesn't quite have an image for you. Don't worry about it. Let it pass over. We're not yet at the stage of making images. We won't be to images until this summer. This summer we'll be concerned with images. But right now, all we're concerned with is getting sensitized to this mysterious process by which unity occurs out of mystery. And when it occurs out of mystery, one has already a complementation. Because as soon as one occurs, zero then is established. The early pre-Socratic Greek philosopher Parmenides called this a disjunctive polarity. And the way in which he phrased it in a mystical poem called The Way by Parmenides, and later on in Greek thought it was called The Way of Parmenides. And it was so difficult to work with that when Socrates was teaching the young men in Athens, he made sure that the first philosophic quandary that they got into was the Parmenidean disjunctive polarity. And it badgered Plato so much that in the great mature Plato of later years, he wrote a dialogue called the Parmenides that took this impossible idea that was so fundamental to task and found that the only resolution for it was outside the conversation that was happening about it, and that only a third person, only a third man outside the conversation would have the gestalt fine enough to be able to appreciate that the disjunctiveness of the polarity was existential and real, as long as one was existential. But as soon as you transcended existence, the polarity became a complementarity and a new level of unity occurred. And it was the new transcendent unity that was real. And the old disjunctive polarity was no longer real. Now, this is extremely difficult to talk about. What Parmenides said simply was, what is, and what isn't, isn't. And that the is and isn't never meet. There is no point of tangention. They're not tangential. They're not tangent. There's no way they ever touch. Is and isn't do not touch in existence. They mutually repel each other to such an extent that the more that they're brought together, the more that they push apart. And this asymptotic pushing apart at the very point at which they were juncture makes it impossible for them to ever touch. One asks then, in that kind of polarity, that means that is and isn't never form a super thing, and that's true. What forms then is not the super thing between is and isn't, but what becomes more and more the clay out of which forms can be made are the tension lines between them. And so the tension lines between is and isn't, as they become closer and closer together, have more and more the vibrancy, the packed stuff of things. And it's in those tension lines between is and isn't that nature forms its seeds. And so in a mysterious way, if one were super yogi, one could unravel the very fabric of existence, and if you did so, you would not be left with a pile of string. You would be left with nothing whatsoever, exactly. It unravels. Where does Te unravel? It unravels into Tao without leaving a trace. And so one of the earliest illustrations of this way in which existence and mystery interpenetrate, that there's something odd about man and nature. Nature is like a Tao, and man is like a form in Tao, and yet has some kind of deep reverberation with Tao, that somehow in the movement of reality, where we are, called Zhen in Chinese, the third phase of a 5-phase energy cycle, Tao, Te, Zhen. Where we are, we're at the middle, we're at the equanimity. And in our equanimity, we allow for the exchange of whatever is on either side of us. And if we maintain a balance which is perfectly equal, if we maintain a yogic presence of complete creativity and receptivity, exactly the same, what is on either side of us can flow through us back and forth without leaving a mark or a trace. And on one side of us is Te, the unity itself, unity as existence, the oomph of existence. And existence passes through us, and what would be on the other side, symmetrical parallel to Te? To the ancient Chinese, they said that was mind. And that mind is characterized by symbols called Yi, not like I Ching, but similar to that, the Yi. So that mind and existence pass through us in our perfect equanimity and exchange with each other. So that while existence has an objective thusness, the mind also has an objective thusness. It can borrow from existence the very stuff of objectivity. And so the mind, far from being a theater of illusion, a page of appearance, the mind is as objectively real as stuff, as things, as existence. But in order for the mind's existence to be firm and certain, it has to have the ability to have the flow freely from Te. And that only happens when Zhen is balanced. And when Zhen is balanced, not only does Te, not only does existence in mind interpenetrate, but even farther afield, Tao interpenetrates with something else. The first phase of the five-phase energy, the Tao interpenetrates with the fifth phase. And the Chinese called the fifth phase heaven, earth, or the 10,000 things. We would call it, using Greek language mind designation, we would call it multiplicity. That multiplicity, the multiplicity of the world, is real because it borrows its reality from the mystery of Tao. Just as the mind borrowed its thusness from existence, the world of the 10,000 things, the multiplicity, are quite actual because it has Tao. Now, in this five-phase energy cycle, which is a much more realistic way of looking at the I Ching than yin-yang, this five-phase energy cycle is apparent because it's an ecology that occurs without leaving a trace, because the world of 10,000 things, when they are guaranteed by the equanimity of man, by Zhen being in balance, when man is in balance, the world flows back into Tao without leaving a trace. There's no remainder. But when man is unbalanced, not only does existence and mind have a crunch, they don't quite meet. And the more unbalanced man becomes, the less they meet. The same thing with Tao and the world. The world has less and less Tao. And instead of factoring back into Tao, it tends, like a dry vomiting, to create a sixth place. And that sixth place is a world of neurotic fantasization. It's a stupid echoing of the world trying desperately to be more than what it is. It's like a film that's showing through a projector, and the gate is dirty and it gets stuck and the film shudders and you see this kind of jerky, stupid image on the screen. And because it's stupid and jerky, the unbalanced Zhen gets frustrated and fed up and tries to make it seem like it's okay and compensates. And in the compensation goes more out of balance. And not only does Tao not flow into the world, but Te doesn't flow into the mind. And the mind, having less and less unity, less and less existence, resorts in compensation more and more to a kind of wild imagination called fantasization. And because that wild fantasization is trying to rebound with an appearance realm of a sixth phase, one gets caught into this. It's a miraculous phrase that Alan Watts came up with one time at a lecture in the late 1950s. He said, it's almost like a ping pong game between two mad players who are determined to out-cheat each other. These are the days when Alan Watts was still wearing olive gabardine suits and nice trimmed hair and had this beautiful mellowness before he went psychedelically pseudo-sancrosate. And other stories. The key then, in the way in which the Chinese would frame, the Chinese always make an aphorism. And the Chinese aphorism is, man is the bridge between heaven and earth. Man is the bridge between Tao and the earth, which is fruitful and has a genuine multiplicity, which is valuable to life. Because as soon as man occurs, it is only through man's equanimity that Tao infuses the world. Before man occurred, Tao and the world had their continuity. But as soon as man rises, like a volcano from the base of the ocean, breaking through the surface of the ocean and becoming the Hawaiian Islands, as soon as the Hawaiian Islands are there, they affect all the weather. As soon as man is there, he affects the weather of the ecology of the real. And must understand that he is now an essential part, not a small part, but an essential part. He is the balancing part. And that his responsibility is not to make brighter colors, not to make fabulous unknown things so much as to be equanimous. And then all other things are possible. Then you can have colors that have never been seen before. You can have newness that was never dreamed before. One can have the courageous philosophy of an unbounded future. And one doesn't have to go to the mysterious realms of Parmenidean expression to say it. One can use the terms of Robert F. Kennedy. Some men look at the world and ask why, and others look at the world and ask why not. The asking of why is philosophically the old Kantian categorical imperative. Kant said, before you do anything, you must ask yourself the question, what if everyone did this? And quite frequently, in fact, almost all the time, you will curtail yourself from doing this. What if everyone did this? The categorical imperative. Whereas Søren Kierkegaard came out with the complementarity, the polarity to it, the existential imperative, where one should rather ask the question, what if no one did this? And very frequently, the answer is the world, the universe, will be minus this value. So the courage for something new has this existential imperative, which goes quite opposite to tradition, quite opposite to what one would ask if one were categorically trying to stay in the way things are. The way things are is traditional wisdom. It's very stable, but it has a floor and ceiling that are full of jeopardy for man. For as long as man is equanimous, that floor and ceiling are all right. They flow like the banks of a river. But if you get unbalanced even a little bit, much less to the extent of this age, then the floor and ceiling are hit against every time you move. And sticking with the way things are is a death grip. The great Roman physicist Lucretius, in 50 BC, when he wrote his book De Rerum Natura, which translates as The Way Things Are, a characterization of the universe, he also characterized the dilemma of his times. He said, we can no longer stand the ignorance which is polluting our lives, and we are not strong enough to endure the cure. And so we are trapped between the disease and the fragility of withstanding the cure, and lead, I think he was the first to use the phrase that translates as silent, desperate lives. One sees this right away in the very first century AD. When you look at the great Roman statues of powerful men, the physiologically beach boy perfect generals who were ruling the world, from a distance they look like hunks. But when you go closer and look at the expression in the eyes, deep within the physiological power are eyes haunted by pathos. There is the fragile crumbling that even a mountain of iron cannot sustain. And such men who make such worlds, of those the great American poet Wallace Stevens said, these are the heroes so-called that time granulates. This quality of appreciating deeply the way in which receptivity and creativity work together, and work together in such a way that when they're equanimous, they exchange places, is the very essence of the I Ching. It has nothing to do with the yin-yang school of Su Jian. Su Yan of 350 BC is a later interpolator. Useful, interesting, not applicable here. When we look at the way in which hexagrams build up, notice how we come back again. We always return back, but we're returned back refreshed, with having had what Thoreau calls an excursion. You come back home, but you come back home with a sensitivity of the excursion into context. And by doing so, again and again, one builds a tolerance for deeper sensitivity. And one realizes that there are contexts for contexts, and on, and that they do not just occur in ambiguity, but they occur at registering levels of existence, and that eventually one finds that the total pattern of all those levels forms an 8. That there is an 8 quality to the way in which existence registers. Unity, oneness, becomes one vis-a-vis a context which could only be designated 0. 1 occurs because 0 now allows it to be 1. And the 1 and the 0 relate together as a 2. And so two-ness has a very peculiar quality. It's the two-ness of 1 and 0. 1 and 0 together are mysteriously the 2. One hears this kind of mystery in the early language of the teaching Jesus, where he says, wherever 2 or more together are gathered in my name, God will be there. The 2 is actually the 1 and the 0 together. But at the same time, it is a 2 in polarity. The two-ness, which is unity and 0 together, is the way in which 2 occurs in reality, in complementarity. In polarity, they occur in this Parmenidean disjunctiveness, is and isn't. The 1 and the 0, instead of coming together and forming that kind of 2, an inclusive 2, the 1 and the 0 form a disjunctive 2. And so one has a polarity. And one says of that 2 that this is duality. And to give it a name, the way the Egyptians gave a name to this form, they called that the duad. In the duad, yes and no never meet. And because they never meet, they have a tension which is permanent between them, and forms made on that tension have an almost certain quality of existence. They're not quite certain. They're not as certain as unity, but certain enough. And that's the material that the ego uses to make its basis. It uses that kind of quality. So that the ego, to use the way in which Yeats, W.B. Yeats said, our worldly self counts on conflict to ensure that it's okay. It gets addicted and habituated to conflict because that's the only way it can check itself out, pinch itself hard enough to know that it's all right because I'm still there. So that the struggle, the fight, is the guarantee of the fact of ongoingness. And that education is keeping track of who's winning and losing. Now you can see that this egotistical quality, this perspective, leads eventually to a box canyon. It leads to a dead end. And the dead end is tautology. because the final certainty of this way of checking identity is to reduce everything down to the most certain statement one can make, A equals A. And if you chant A equals A over and over again, you won't go anywhere. Because the existence of A in the equation A equals A is fully dependent on A being a unity in and of itself. For if it has reference to anything else, its partiality is assured, not its actuality. And so, in a way, the ego feeds like a vampire on fractionating life. It can only breathe and eat and consume fractionated life. It has to break things up in order to exist. And so it crushes all the time. It loves to break. And there's no Tao in that. There's no quality of wholeness in that. Now this duad, this mysteriousness of two, that two sometimes is a pair that work together in a complementarity, and yet two sometimes is a disjunctive polarity, which never work together, characterizes the way in which Melville begins Moby Dick. The very first chapter, Loomings, ends with the mystery of the two kinds of two. This is how it reads in Moby Dick. I love to sail forbidden seas and land on barbarous coasts. Not ignoring what is good, I am quick to perceive a horror and could still be social with it, would they let me, since it is but well to be on friendly terms with all the inmates of the place one lodges in. By reason of these things, then, the whaling voyage was welcome, the great floodgates of the wonder world swung open, and in the wild conceits that swayed me to my purpose, two and two, there floated into my inmost soul endless processions of the whale. And midmost of them all, one grand hooded phantom, like a snow hill in the air. These processions of twos, two by two, is the odd square that's made out of a complementary two and a polarity two, a disjunctive two that never touch, and a complementary pair that only touch at one tangential point in complete equanimity. And the Chinese way in the I Ching of understanding man is that man has this freedom, that exactly at his two-ness, Zhen is characterized by two, just as Te by one, just as Tao by zero. Zhen is characterized by two. Man's two is always double. His pair is always paired. One pair of that square is that tension is the rule and disjunctiveness is the principle. That's the source of yin-yang. Whereas in the other way, it's not tension, but it's exchange. It's not the polarity, but the complementarity. And so there is this kind of mystery in man, and part of the difficulty of appreciating the fineness of this thought, the fineness of this appreciation of nature, is that the ego will always transpose. It will always make the two kinds of two, the yin-yang. It will say that the yin is the acceptance of both, and the yang is the penetration of the two. Now, this is a very famous error. This is a fault, a flaw, which has been pointed out many times in the history of this planet. There is no way that the disjunctiveness belongs to the pairs. The disjunctiveness is in one of the pairs, not in the other. If you see it as in both of the pairs, then you have a very prejudicial, flawed outlook, and nature becomes something suspicious, forever suspicious. One thing that characterizes the I Ching is that nature is not suspicious, it is mysterious. The Greek way of understanding this was that in the polarity energy of disjunctiveness, tragedy characterizes life. And the complement to tragedy was that comedy occurs. Whereas in the Chinese understanding, it was that tragedy and comedy were a pair. Comedy is when polarity happens to work for a while together, that the disjunctiveness is entertaining. But the tragedy is that it went too far. In the Chinese I Ching worldview, tragedy and comedy are in one pair, and the other pair is mystery. So that one can then say that there are three forms of drama. There's tragedy, there's comedy, and there's mystery. And it turns out in Western theatrical and development that actually mystery turns out to be history. The first Greek language mind to recognize this was Pythagoras. He recognized the way in which numerical progression had a historical geometry to it. And the saying was, geometry is history. Now, it takes a lot of insight to be able to understand how this can work out. How can geometry be history? For this, we need to jump ahead just a minute and take a look at one of our later texts in nature, the double helix. On page 148, where James Watson is describing how he and the young Francis Crick were trying to outguess the old lion of chemistry, Linus Pauling, trying to get to the way in which DNA's structure was before the old genius found it, so that they could be world famous and not him. Well, he's famous enough. He doesn't need it. Well, he didn't need it. And so Watson writes here on page 148, under the title, this section of the double helix is called The Molecular Basis of Biological Specificity. The molecular basis of specificity. And before he gets to the way in which life processes are specific in terms of molecular structure, one has to understand that organic specificity is based on inorganic specificity, and one then has to appreciate, how does inorganic nature specify? How do things come into purified exact being before there's organic distillation? And the answer to that is crystallization. There are a few other ways, but crystallization is the fundamental one. Watson writes, it became evident that non-biological specificity could also be explained in terms of complementarity. Lo and behold. I gave an example in a lecture on analogies between antibodies and simpler chemical substances. The reaction shown by simple chemical substances, that is, analogous to that of specific combination of antigen and antibody, is the formation of a crystal of a substance from solution. A crystal of a molecular substance is stable because all of the molecules pile themselves into a configuration that each molecule is surrounded as closely as possible by other molecules. That is, if a molecule were to be removed from the interior of a crystal, the cavity that it would leave would very nearly shape that molecule itself. Notice here the down. In a crystalline form of many molecules, if you removed one molecule from that crystalline form, it would leave a space that is exactly the shape of that molecule. Formlessness and form in equanimity. It's in that precise cavity that a distillation process could happen without organic chemistry taking place. And on that very peculiar, mysterious basis, the collection of chemical possibilities edged closer and closer to the probability of the development of early amino acids. And it's remember we started with the way in which the continuity accrues, repeating over and over again for billions of years with just slight variations in the flutter of pure repetition, not being quite exact because existence always has a slight flutter. Over billions of years, the right chemicals collected in such precise cavities of inorganic form that the very chemical basis of life accumulated finally at last and became stable. To appreciate this is almost miraculous. To be able to sense that this not only really happened and actually happened, but actually is real all the time. Because it's the only way that any existence, even on the level of organic life, occurs at all. For if every cell did not participate in this mysterious exchange, there would be no way that chemical reality could establish itself on level of existence. Every cell and every being, no matter what, repeats this process all the time, without which it could not be. So the mystery is not that it happened way back when, but that it continues even now. An education that does not sensitize to this level and scope and context of this actuality is not an education, but an indoctrination. Whether there's a doctrinaire form there for you to be conscious of or not, the very pattern of it is indoctrinating. And what does its success universally owe itself to? Because the ego evilly lives and breathes with this fractionization. It needs to have these shards. It cannot breathe wholeness. It cannot use completeness. It shuns from perfection because it sees it as death. It sees it in its way as a dead end. And so you will find during this education all the time, you will find resistances that come up, and the resistances always are variations on a theme. This is not the day I'm going to show up. I don't really want to go today. I don't want to read something. I don't want to do something. All these resistances are a part of the way in which forms of fractionized existence surface and occur. And rather than shunning them, they're welcomed because they're the materia out of which we can transform. Transform what? Transform those resistances, those polarities, back into the actuality at which they work. Because the polarities do not work in actuality qua polarities. They work with the tension energies between them. Electricity works because it's a flow of tension. That's why it's electricity. And the first human being to understand that was Benjamin Franklin. If it were in some way other than in the tension, you would not be able to store it. And the storing of electricity in Leyden jars was established as early as the 1740s by Benjamin Franklin. The accrual of electrical energy through continuity of process is the very beginnings of the whole electrical element of the modern world. So too, on the molecular level, the accrual of the ability of form to occupy precisely the same structure, even though it is formless, that form and formlessness have an exchange level at the very precise threshold of equanimity. This is like the yogic point, the genesis point, if you like, of the way in which all life, all intelligent life, if you want to go that far, the way in which we occur, without which it wouldn't happen. In the I Ching, the early I Ching, it was presented very beautifully. The movement up of the lines, the yang line in between two yin lines, moves from the bottom to the middle to the top. And just so, the yin line moves from the bottom to the middle to the top. Exactly in the middle, those two trigrams exchange with each other without leaving a trace. The trigram in the middle of one is the symbol for water. The trigram in the middle of the other is the symbol for fire. That fire and water exchange with each other in equanimity, in perfect equanimity. And that's why you see in the Tai Chi symbol a spot of dark in the light, a spot of light in the dark. It's the exchange of fire and water. The basis of alchemical transformation is that forms change into other forms with complete equanimity, because the substrate shared by both is ambidextrous. It will take either one without prejudice. When we come back next week, I'll try and carry this forward, not to push it forward, but carry it forward and show you how the hexagrams developed out of this, and why the 64 hexagrams match up with the 64 codons that are the language of beginning and ending of genetic sequences. One has to have a special genetic sequence initiator. One has to have a trigram, a base codon of 3 bases together in order to start a genetic sentence. But originally, in the primordial life form, it was not 1 but 3 codons that formed the basis. So just as in the I Ching, that there was a former heavenly pattern and a later humanity pattern, so too in the way in which RNA works. Mitochondrial RNA worked with a 3 codon initial point, whereas modern RNA works with an initial single codon. And these match the I Ching hexagrams precisely. Why? Because the binary substrate process is exactly the same. You can write 64 in 2, let's make it 3 different ways. 64 can be 8 squared. It can be written 8 squared. It can be written 4 cubed, and it can be written 2 to the 4th power. Each of those expressions is an energy order which is different from the other. And on each of those levels of energy order, one can use the same symbol but in different designation to open up whole different horizons of expression. On the level of unity, 64 as a pattern of unity is unity and unity alone. But when you come down to pairs to the fourth power, 2 to the fourth power, though it is still 64, written in that way, one can express almost unbelievable differentiation. How unbelievable? Every single life form in the universe is written with that symbolic code as its initial expressive foundation, without end. More next week. Thank you.